Part 1, Dramatic Hook, 250 words. In the pre-dawn hours of October 14, 1943, German Luftwaffe pilots gathered around briefing tables on airfields near Würzburg and Frankfurt. They shared a common joke. The American B-17 Flying Fortress, they claimed, was a lumbering tin can, slow and unwieldy, an easy target for their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s. In previous sorties, these aces had tallied dozens of kills against American bombers. Statistics seemed to confirm their confidence. In just 1 month, German fighter units of Jagdgeschwader 3 and Jagdgeschwader 11 claimed over 100 heavy bombers destroyed. The flak batteries around Schweinfurt, manned by hundreds of gunners with 88mm and 105mm anti-aircraft cannons, had brought down more than 30 aircraft in a single raid. The odds appeared overwhelming. But on this day, the numbers shifted. Of the 291 Boeing B-17G Flying Fortresses that roared east from British bases, over 60 would be shot down, and more than 600 American airmen killed or captured. Yet, when the battered survivors limped home, ground crews at RAF Netteschall and Bassingbourn counted the damage. One B-17, piloted by Lieutenant Charles Brown of the 379th Bomb Group, landed with over 300 holes from shrapnel, flak, and bullets. Another, missing half its tail stabilizer, still made it back across the channel. The Luftwaffe pilots who had laughed at American bombers now watched in disbelief as these tin cans survived direct hits that should have torn them apart. The legend of the B-17's resilience was no longer a rumor, it was a fact, written in metal and blood. Part 2, Historical Setup, 350 words. At precisely 1030 hours on October 14, 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched Mission 115, the second major daylight assault against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Bavaria. Lieutenant Colonel Bud Peasley, commanding officer of the 384th Bomb Group, led a formation of 291 B-17G Flying Fortress bombers from airfields spread across eastern England. The operation was coordinated with the 305th Bombardment Group and the 96th Bomb Group, under the overall command of Brigadier General Curtis LeMay, who orchestrated the mission from 8th Air Force Headquarters at High Wycombe. The strategic target, Schweinfurt, lay 600 kilometers from the English coast, deep within Nazi-controlled territory and well beyond the range of P-47 Thunderbolt and Spitfire escorts. The factories at Schweinfurt produced nearly half of Germany's ball bearings, a critical component for tanks, trucks, and aircraft. The route to the target required the bombers to penetrate layered defenses, first, radar-guided flak belts outside Antwerp and Aachen, then, fighter interception zones patrolled by Gruppen of Messerschmitt Bf-109G6S and Focke-Wulf Fw-190A6S, armed with 20mm MG-151 cannons and racks of WGR-21 air-to-air rockets. Each B-17G was powered by 4 Wright or 1820-97 Cyclone radial engines, capable of cruising at 250 miles per hour and carrying a bomb payload of up to 8,000 pounds. Defensive armament included up to 13.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, manned by gunners in nose, dorsal, waist, and tail positions. Armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks provided additional protection, but the crews knew that a direct hit from an 88mm flak shell could still tear a fortress apart. The mission briefing outlined a straight, uncompromising approach. The bombers would fly in tight combat boxes, maintain formation discipline, and rely on mutual defensive firepower. With P-47s forced to turn back near Eupen, the B-17s would face over 300 enemy fighters and dozens of flak batteries alone for the final 350 miles to Schweinfurt. Success depended on determination, discipline, and the structural integrity of the flying fortress itself. Part 3, Rising Tension, 300 words. At 1045 hours, the first formations of B-17s crossed the Dutch coastline near the Scheldt estuary. Ground-based radar operators of Flak Regiment 65 tracked their progress and relayed real-time coordinates to Luftwaffe scramble teams. By 11:20 hours, Major Heinrich Erler, Gruppen commander of 2/JG5, dispatched 16 Bf-109G6 fighters from an airfield near Wiesbaden. Simultaneously, at 1124 hours, anti-aircraft crews near Aachen opened fire with 88mm Flak 36 guns, sending shrapnel into the lower elements of the bomber stream. Inside the lead bomber, Captain Robert Morgan of the 91st Bomb Group scanned for enemy fighters as his navigator, Lieutenant Charles F. Fulks, corrected course. At 1140 hours, the first wave of FW-190S-6S from JG-11 attacked from above, launching WGR-21 rockets into the formation. Waist Gunner Sergeant John Quinlan returned fire with his .50 caliber, watching tracer rounds arc into the sky. Seconds later, his aircraft shuddered as flak punched through the wing, disabling one engine. By 11:55 hours, the bombers entered the Schweinfurt flak corridor. Over 40 batteries, each firing up to 20 rounds per minute, created a wall of exploding shells. On the ground, German factory workers and anti-aircraft spotters observed the sky filled with black bursts and burning aircraft. At 1205 hours, Brigadier General Curtis LeMay, monitoring from the operations room at High Wycombe, received the first coded distress calls: aircraft down, multiple casualties. In the air, the surviving B-17s pressed on, dropping their bomb loads over the target at 1217 hours. Despite catastrophic damage, missing control surfaces, engines trailing fire, and hundreds of punctures, several crews managed to turn for home. From the German perspective, disbelief grew as bomber after bomber, riddled and burning, clawed its way westward. The stage was set for a homecoming few believed possible. In the hours following the battered bombers' return, a grim tableau unfolded across the airfields of eastern England. Ambulances threaded between the parked, wounded B-17s, while ground crews clambered over shattered fuselages, cataloguing the day's toll. At RAF Bassingbourn, Lieutenant Colonel William R. Cameron, executive officer of the 92nd Bomb Group, surveyed the scene with a heavy heart. Mechanics counted the bullet holes, sometimes hundreds in a single aircraft, while medics triaged wounded airmen, their faces streaked with oil and blood. Missing crews haunted the mission debriefings, entire squadrons failed to check in. In Berlin, word of the attack's cost filtered through the Reichsluftfahrtministerium. General der Flieger Gunther Korten convened a closed-door session with Armaments Minister Albert Speer. Reports indicated at least 60 bombers lost, with dozens more crippled. Yet, initial factory damage assessments suggested Schweinfurt's bearing plants had sustained less damage than feared. German production managers, like Dr. Otto Lowy of Kugelfischer, scrambled to reroute supply chains and draft emergency repair teams into the smoldering works. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence officers pored over reconnaissance photos and pilot reports. At the U.S. 8th Air Force headquarters, Colonel James P. Hodges received intercepted Luftwaffe communications. German fighter reserves had been stretched to the limit, with units forced to land at secondary airfields or unable to rearm for hours. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park decrypted frantic Enigma messages detailing ammunition shortages and pilot exhaustion. For the families of missing crews, telegrams began to arrive by the following morning. In small towns across America, church bells tolled and neighbors gathered on porches as news spread. At the same time, the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht celebrated the Schweinfurt victory, broadcasting images of down-flying fortresses and captured airmen. But beneath the surface, anxiety simmered. German commanders worried about how many more such raids they could repel. By week's end, both sides took stock. The Allies debated whether the cost in men and machines was sustainable. German industrial planners, meanwhile, braced for follow-up raids, aware that even limited damage to bearing production could ripple through the war economy. In the ruined factories of Schweinfurt, civilian workers labored around the clock, patching shattered walls and clearing debris, racing against time to restore output. The lessons of that brutal day quickly became the subject of high-level analysis. Allied planners, led by Brigadier General Haywood S. Hansel, convened a post-mission review at Bomber Command headquarters. The statistics were sobering. Out of the initial attacking force, nearly 20% had failed to return. Many of those that limped home would never fly again. Damage to the Schweinfurt ball bearing plants, though significant in places, fell short of crippling German production. Estimates suggested as little as a 30% reduction in output, far less than the decisive blow strategists had hoped for. Technical officers highlighted the effectiveness of the German air defense network. The use of radar-guided flak, coordinated fighter intercepts, and rocket-equipped FW-190s had created a deadly gauntlet. Post-mission interviews documented how tight Luftwaffe coordination forced bomber crews to fly in compact, predictable formations, making them easier targets for both anti-aircraft fire and head-on fighter attacks. Several returning pilots described the box barrage tactic, where German fighters would launch rockets and then peel away, allowing flak to finish off the disorganized bombers. Comparing Schweinfurt to earlier raids, such as the attack on Regensburg, analysts noted a troubling trend. Without long-range escort fighters, daylight bombing in deep enemy territory resulted in unsustainable losses. The Luftwaffe, though suffering its own casualties, retained enough experienced pilots and aircraft to mount concentrated counterattacks. Reconnaissance photos revealed that some factories were already resuming limited production, undermining claims of a decisive strategic victory. Expert assessments pointed to two major vulnerabilities. First, the lack of adequate fighter escort exposed bombers to relentless attacks for hundreds of miles. Second, the predictability of Allied tactics allowed German defenders to concentrate resources with deadly efficiency. Reports from downed crews, now prisoners of war, confirmed that German fighter controllers were able to track the bomber stream with remarkable accuracy, anticipating their approach hours in advance. Evidence accumulated that the cost of deep penetration raids was rapidly outpacing their strategic benefits. Historians would later debate whether the lessons of Schweinfurt were heeded quickly enough. For now, Allied command faced a stark choice: persist with daylight precision bombing at great cost, or rethink the entire approach to strategic air warfare. The shockwaves from Schweinfurt rippled through Allied command structures. At the highest echelons, General Ira Eaker of the 8th Air Force convened emergency meetings with British Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris and representatives from the U.S. Army Air Forces. The debate was heated. Some advocated suspending deep penetration raids until sufficient long-range escort fighters, like the P-51 Mustang, could be fielded. Others, mindful of the pressure to cripple German industry before the upcoming invasion of Western Europe, argued that the offensive must continue, if only to keep the Luftwaffe occupied. Within days, new operational orders landed on the desks of group and squadron commanders. Bomber formations were ordered to tighten their defensive boxes, and gunners received intensified training in identifying and repelling German fighter tactics. Engineering teams accelerated experiments with auxiliary fuel tanks for P-47 Thunderbolts, hoping to extend their escort range. At airfields across East Anglia, pilots drilled new evasive maneuvers and practiced rapid formation changes designed to confound enemy interceptors. On the German side, the success of the defense emboldened Luftwaffe leadership but masked deeper strategic vulnerabilities. Aircraft losses and pilot fatigue mounted with each engagement. Intelligence briefings warned that American production capacity far outstripped the Reich's ability to replace lost fighters. Rumors circulated of new Allied escort fighters capable of reaching targets deep inside Germany, stoking unease among squadron leaders. As autumn deepened, both sides prepared for the next phase. The Allies, chastened but determined, funneled resources into developing longer-range fighter escorts and improved bombing tactics. The Germans, wary of future raids, reinforced key industrial sites and rotated exhausted aircrews to the front. The skies over Europe remained a lethal battleground, with each side searching for the advantage that might finally tip the balance. In the shadows of ruined factories and damaged airfields, the struggle for air supremacy entered a new, more desperate chapter, one where technology, leadership, and the will to endure would decide the fate of nations. Part 1: Lesser-known details. As the winter of 1943 settled over England and Germany, the war in the air became not only a contest of firepower and tactics, but of endurance in the face of logistical and environmental adversity, a reality rarely reflected in the sanitized tables of official reports. At RAF Bassingbourn, ground mechanic Sergeant Frank Williams recorded in his battered diary the endless struggle to keep B-17s operational in the face of biting cold and chronic shortages. Frost on the wings before dawn, mud to the ankles by noon. We've cannibalized 3 birds this week to get just one in the air. HQ says the parts are coming. Where from, I wonder? America or the moon? Official communiques boasted of relentless bombing pressure, but the maintenance logs told another story: dozens of sorties scrubbed due to lack of functional engines, oxygen systems, or even heated flying suits. Pilots and gunners frequently flew with dangerously unreliable equipment, a fact seldom mentioned beyond base boundaries. On the German side, the Luftwaffe's technical staff grappled with their own crises. Declassified post-war documents reveal that, by late 1943, aviation gasoline had become a precious commodity. Squadrons at Jagdgeschwader 26 were forced to fly training flights on reduced throttle, conserving every liter for the next major interception. One internal memo from Oberstleutnant Friedrich Beck lamented, "We have the pilots, but not the fuel. We have the orders, but not the parts. The Reich's vaunted industrial efficiency buckled under the relentless Allied campaign and the growing threat of sabotage by forced laborers, another factor rarely acknowledged in wartime propaganda. Weather, too, emerged as an adversary. Fog and freezing rain regularly grounded entire bomber groups, while German radar operators struggled with atmospheric interference that distorted their tracking instruments. In one instance, a sudden snow squall over the Harz Mountains scattered a returning U.S. formation, forcing emergency landings across the English countryside. A navigator's logbook described the confusion: no radio, no landmarks, just white. We landed in a beet field, prayed it was friendly. These ground-level realities exposed the chasm between official doctrine and the war as actually fought. While staff officers debated strategy in heated war rooms, the men on the periphery endured hunger, cold, and uncertainty. Their diaries and after-action reports, once dismissed as mere human interest, now offer a sobering counterpoint to the grand narratives of air power and precision. Part 2: Historian Perspectives. For decades, the Schweinfurt raids and their aftermath were interpreted through the prism of Allied victory and technological triumph. Early post-war histories, relying heavily on official Air Force accounts, cast the period as a necessary crucible, painful, but ultimately vindicated by the eventual defeat of the Luftwaffe. It was not until the 1970s, with the release of previously classified ultra-decrypts and Luftwaffe records, that a more nuanced picture emerged. Historian Dr. Marion Faber, in her influential monograph, The Limits of Precision, challenged the notion that Allied command acted with perfect foresight. What emerges, she wrote, is a pattern of improvisation, missed signals, and the persistent underestimation of German resilience. Declassified signals intelligence revealed that German fighter deployment was often less coordinated than the Allies feared, and that the real damage to German industry was frequently mitigated by rapid repairs and dispersal of critical machinery. Modern scholarship has continued to revise the accepted narrative. Detailed studies of production records and POW interrogations have shown that the psychological impact of the raids on German workers, heightened absenteeism, morale collapse, and the spread of defeatist rumors may have been as significant as the physical destruction. Conversely, recent research into the Allied side, such as Dr. Samuel Aitken's Shadow Factories, The Hidden Cost of Victory, uncovers the human toll exacted by relentless operational demands, rising suicide rates among aircrew, breakdowns from chronic sleep deprivation, and the emergence of what we now recognize as PTSD. Academic debate remains lively. Some historians argue that the focus on Big Week and later escort innovations overshadows the cumulative attrition inflicted on the Luftwaffe during this period. Others contend that the Allies' willingness to accept appalling losses was less a mark of strategic genius and more a testament to institutional inertia and political pressure from Washington and London. In this new light, the winter of 1943-44 stands not just as a prelude to victory, but as a crucible of costly lessons many only fully understood with the benefit of hindsight and newly available evidence. Part 3: Human Stories. In the midst of these vast, impersonal forces, the war was lived intimately by individuals, each with their own burdens, hopes, and scars. Consider Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Ralston, a navigator from Des Moines, Iowa. Ralston's letters home reveal a young man grappling with the terror and monotony of daily missions. "Ma, I keep my lucky nickel in my pocket. The fellows joke, but I think it's worked so far. My hands shake every time we cross the channel." On November 14, 1943, Ralston's B-17 was forced down in neutral Switzerland after an engine fire. Interned for the remainder of the war, he spent his days teaching English to Swiss students. After liberation, he struggled to adapt to civilian life, haunted by survivor's guilt and plagued by nightmares, symptoms unrecognized and untreated in his era. He would later become an advocate for veteran mental health, his testimony shaping early post-war reforms. Across the lines, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Meissner, a Luftwaffe mechanic from Dresden, experienced the war far from the cockpit's glory. Meissner's journal, discovered in a trunk decades after his death, details the endless improvisation required to keep FW-190s flying: wire from old radios, rubber from bicycle tires, anything to patch the birds. His entries grow increasingly despondent as friends are lost and rations dwindle. After the war, Meissner was conscripted into Soviet forced labor, returning home in 1949 a changed man. He found work as a school janitor, rarely speaking of the war, but his meticulous repairs of broken classroom windows and clocks became a quiet testament to a lifetime spent mending things shattered by conflict. Then there was Corporal Elsie Woodward, a member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force stationed at a radar post in Suffolk. Her role, long overlooked in mainstream histories, was critical, tracking incoming raids and relaying vectors to intercepting fighters. In her oral history, Woodward recalled the strain: every blip could mean friends or death. We worked in shifts, barely saw daylight for months. After the war, she became a schoolteacher and, in her retirement, an outspoken advocate for women's recognition in wartime service. Her campaign contributed to the memorialization of female personnel at the Imperial War Museum. These lives, shaped and scarred by a conflict waged in the skies above, remind us that the true legacy of air warfare is written not only in tonnage dropped or factories destroyed, but in the hearts and memories of those who endured its storms. Part 1: Strategic Consequences. In the immediate days following the events chronicled here, both sides recalibrated with a mix of relief, desperation, and resolve. For the Allied air forces, the first tangible effect was a shift in bomber tactics. Formations began to fly at varying altitudes and routes, reducing predictability and exploiting the Luftwaffe's exhausted response capacity. German air defense commands, meanwhile, instituted round-the-clock alert rotations, but their ranks had been thinned by relentless attrition, forcing younger, less experienced pilots into the fray. Within weeks, the operational tempo across Western Europe changed. The Allies, emboldened by their hard-won foothold, intensified their focus on rail infrastructure and oil production sites, seeking to exploit the cracks in German logistics exposed by earlier raids. The Luftwaffe, compelled to conserve dwindling resources, prioritized the defense of the Reich's industrial heartland, leaving less critical areas vulnerable. This strategic redistribution further strained German command, sowing confusion and forcing a permanent state of triage. By spring and summer, these adjustments rippled into broader campaigns. The cumulative wear on German fighter strength, combined with the destruction of essential repair facilities, led to a visible degradation in the Luftwaffe's ability to contest Allied air superiority. Allied planners, recognizing this advantage, accelerated preparations for the Normandy landings, confident that the skies could be controlled or at least contested on favorable terms. The shift in air dominance was not absolute, but it was decisive enough to enable vast movements of men and material by land and sea, with reduced threat from above. Years later, the consequences of these months became still more apparent. Post-war analyses revealed how the relentless pressure on German industry and air defense irreversibly eroded the Reich's capacity to sustain prolonged resistance. The forced dispersal of factories, while temporarily effective, fragmented production lines and complicated supply chains, compounding inefficiencies as the war dragged on. In the post-war decades, military historians and strategists would point to this period as a textbook example of how air power, when wielded with persistence and adaptability, could shape not just battles, but the very structure of an adversary's war effort. The cumulative effects, measured in lost sorties and crippled infrastructure, echoed far beyond the war's end, influencing doctrine and defense planning for generations to come. Part 2: Turning Point Analysis. Had these pivotal actions not unfolded as they did, the trajectory of the conflict might have skewed in unpredictable and potentially catastrophic directions. Without the attrition inflicted on the Luftwaffe and the disruption of German industry, the Allies' ability to project power across the Channel would have faced far greater resistance. Some analysts suggest that a Luftwaffe still capable of massed interception in mid-1944 could have threatened the entire Normandy operation, inflicting prohibitive casualties on transport and supply convoys and perhaps delaying or even derailing the liberation of Western Europe. Comparisons to other strategic bombing campaigns, such as the later attacks on Japanese cities, highlight both the uniqueness and the limitations of this period. While the scale of destruction in Germany was immense, the lessons learned about target selection, crew welfare, and enemy adaptation would shape subsequent Allied operations. Unlike the area bombing of Hamburg or Dresden, the focus here was increasingly on precision and attrition, reflecting a maturation in both aim and method. Consensus among historians has gradually coalesced around the view that these months marked a clear inflection point in the European air war. The mythology of the all-powerful bomber force has given way to a more nuanced understanding, one that recognizes the interplay of industrial resilience, technological innovation, and sheer human endurance. The debates persist, but few now dispute that the relentless aerial campaign, with all its sacrifices and missteps, decisively undermined the German war machine's ability to recover and adapt. Our understanding has evolved with each new trove of documents and survivor testimony. Early post-war accounts, colored by triumphalism and political agendas, often obscured the war's true complexity. Today, access to German archives and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths have enriched the narrative, making clear that the outcome was never inevitable, nor the cost easily justified. What remains undisputed is that the events of this period irrevocably shifted the balance, accelerating the end of a conflict that might otherwise have dragged on, with even greater suffering on all sides. Part 3: Legacy and Memorial. In the years that followed, the individuals who lived through this crucible carved their own paths through a world forever changed. Some, like former aircrew and ground personnel, returned to civilian life carrying invisible wounds, struggling to translate the camaraderie and trauma of wartime into the routines of peace. Others joined veterans' organizations or became quiet advocates for those whose service had gone unrecognized. The ripple effects of their experiences shaped families, communities, and even national policy, as governments belatedly acknowledged the psychological costs of protracted conflict. The memory of these events has been preserved in countless ways. Across Europe and the United States, memorials and museums stand as silent witnesses, the glass panels of the International Bomber Command Center etched with the names of the fallen, the reconstructed radar huts dotting the English countryside, the restored aircraft displayed in hangars from Duxford to Dayton. In Germany, the ruins of once mighty factories have been repurposed as sites of reflection, while plaques commemorate the civilian lives upended by the war in the air. Each commemoration, whether grand or humble, serves as a bridge between past and present, a tangible reminder of choices made and prices paid. The legacy endures not only in stone and steel, but in doctrine. Modern air forces around the globe have absorbed the lessons, both technical and ethical, of those harrowing months. Advances in precision targeting, crew welfare, and psychological support owe much to the hard-won experiences of that era. The debates over proportionality, the balance between military necessity and humanitarian cost, continue to inform military and political leaders alike. Today, nearly a century later, the world still flies in the shadow of those decisions. The air campaign's impact is measured not just in history books, but in every doctrine, memorial, and life touched by the struggle. More than 600,000 civilians and airmen lost their lives in the European Air War. Their sacrifice reshaped the boundaries of strategy and humanity, an indelible record etched into the fabric of modern warfare.